This is Chapter 1 on Information System Security, Part 3. This part, the final part, deals mostly with the human aspect of cybersecurity at a very fundamental level. So, you are the weakest link. That actually was a TV show years ago, I guess in the early 2000s, um, based on a show that originally came from Britain. But anyway, the user is the weakest link in security. No matter what we do, we can't take the person out of a system. We just can't do it. And so people make mistakes. People do things maliciously. More often than not, they do things accidentally. And so we can't take people out and we have to worry about it. So there are strategies for reducing risk, as it says here. Check the background of job candidates carefully before you hire them. Years ago, when I worked at HO Systems, I was hired in with another. I was hired in as a senior software engineer, but at the time, another person was hired in as a project manager, which meant he was in charge of a lot of different people. And he said he had an MBA from Harvard. He was very technically and business wise proficient at what he did. It wasn't like he was lying about what he could do. But several years later, after I had left HO Systems, which was my last job in industry, and came to Armstrong State University, then Armstrong Atlantic, um, one day I was having lunch with friends who were still working at HO before they shut down, and they told me this guy had been fired. I couldn't figure out why. Why? Because even though he had an MBA, it wasn't from Harvard, and they discovered that, and they fired him on the spot for resume fraud. So even though he could do the job, and he was very proficient at it, don't get me wrong, he knew what he was doing, because I didn't work for him, but I knew people that did. But he lied on his resume, and he did have an MBA, but it was from a decent school, but it wasn't an Ivy League school, and they fired him. So you need to check the background of job candidates very carefully. You need to evaluate your staff regularly, not just once a year, maybe twice a year. When I worked at Arthur Anderson and Company, it was every four. If you worked on a job for a client for 40 hours, that's what, one work week? You got your first evaluation. Then after that, you would get one like every 2 weeks. You may not have to be as detailed in terms of staff evaluations as they were, but you do have to evaluate your staff regularly. Perhaps once a year may not be enough. You need to rotate access to sensitive systems, applications, and data among staff positions. And that's important because not only give your employees more knowledge and training in different roles in the company so they can do more things, but think about it. If I'm pilfering things from the company or I'm doing all sorts of data um, analysis where I'm copying data or stealing data, whatever, and I'm moved to another position, I may start doing in that position, but the company may realize that it's not happening anymore in the position I used to hold. So you need to make sure that you rotate access. You need to test your applications and software and review for quality. It goes without saying you should not put, and we all know that it's 1,000 lines of code, 100,000 lines of code, whatever it is. It may not always be perfect, but you've got to try and make it as perfect as possible. Not only because you want the customer to have the best experience possible and the data that they use to be properly manipulated, but you also want to make sure that if you test it properly, there aren't any vulnerabilities that can be exploited in the software. You need to regularly review security plans. That goes without saying. It's Things may have changed. You may have acquired a new server. You may have acquired a new business. You may have built a new location. You may have a new building. You have to have security plans in place that are up to date. And you have to perform annual security control audits. Now, this is not evaluating your staff as much as evaluating the controls that you have in place to ensure that your company works properly from a security viewpoint. Okay, so obviously ethics. We used to use a textbook that had an entire chapter on ethics. Chapter 3 was from the professors up at Kennesaw State. Was The entire chapter was on ethics, and it goes without saying that ethics is crucial to working with what I call OPM, other people's money, or OPD, other people's data. You're dealing with confidential information online or at rest in databases in your corporation or your organization. And you need to make sure that you and your employees work in an ethical fashion regarding that data, that you um, uh, handle that data confidentially, that you secure that data, that you ensure that the data is not exposed to outside uh, entities that it shouldn't get to. As it says here, human behavior online is often less mature than in normal social settings, and the demand for system security professionals is growing so rapidly that acceptable use policies need to be followed, ethics need to be followed. Um, and you have to remember, a policy is not a law or it's not mandated, but the fact of the matter is that in an organization, a policy acts like a law. So if employees work ethically, then they are working in accordance with the policies that you create. And obviously, if they violate a policy, they could be reprimanded, they could be demoted, they could be fired. So ethics are important, and you have to ensure that your employees work in an ethical fashion. Now, the IT security framework is a hierarchical framework for documenting and implementing a set of IT security policies. So the deal here is that you're not, we're talking about technical devices and technical methodologies such as, devices such as routers and switches and wireless access points, and how we use them and how they work and how they're employed. Um, but the policies dictate how they work and how they're employed in the organization. So a policy is a short written statement that defines the course of action that applies to the entire organization. Sometimes policies are written not by technical people, but perhaps by non-technical people. The CEO of an organization will say everybody has to have an 8-character password. Well, maybe not so much he would dictate the number of characters, but he would dictate that passwords be used. And then from there, we would see 2 steps down the procedure on how to create a secure password. The chief executive officer or president would probably not be involved in that, but the chief information security officer would be, or the security manager, in terms of the written instructions for how to use policies and standards. Now, in between the policy and the procedure is the standard, which is a detailed written definition of how software and hardware to be used. And that has to be rigorously followed. And lastly, on the bottom, a guideline. Guidelines are suggested course of action for using a policy, standard, or procedure, not necessarily a requirement, but something that should guide the employee so they know what to do. And it's an approved method. So here we have the hierarchical IT security policy framework. So policy 1 is supported by standards, which are then supported by the step-by-step procedures, and then the guidelines, and the same thing for policy 2 and 3. So foundational security policy. Some of the policies that we use in an organization, an acceptable use policy or an AUP, defines the actions that are and are not allowed with respect to the use of organization-owned IT assets. This policy is specific to the user domain and mitigates risk between an organization and its employees. So every employee should know what the AUP is, or at least know how to find it. And a lot of times AUPs will talk about how to create passwords and things like that. The security awareness policy. If you have one, this policy defines how to ensure that all personnel are aware of the importance of security and behavioral expectations under the organization's security policy. It's specific to the user domain and is relevant when you need to change organizational security awareness behavior. The asset classification policy defines an organization's data classification standard. It tells what IT assets are critical to the organization's mission. It usually defines the organization's systems, uses, and data priorities, and identifies assets within the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. The asset protection policy. Now, again, getting back to the classification, when we talk about classifications, and we may talk about like data classification standards of secret, top secret, confidential. You don't have to use what the military uses or even what the government uses, but you have to come up with your own, and you have to come up with your own uh, definitions of it and how it's applied to data. You need to make sure that data that is supposed to be confidential, which might mean that it can be relayed or distributed throughout the organization to anybody, but not outside the organization, you need to decide what data meets that standard. If it's something that's secret and that's the highest level, maybe that's a trade secret that can't go beyond a certain group of people. I think I used the description of the Coca-Cola company before, and the fact of the matter is ingredient 7X is not just confidential, it's probably secret or even top secret. I don't know what Coke calls it now, but because that's the foundation of the company and it can't leave. But policies on how to enter and leave the building or other things like that might be confidential. Anybody needs to know them, everybody needs to know them, but nobody else outside the organization needs to know them. So, okay, so the asset protection policy, this helps organizations define a priority for mission critical IT systems and data. It's aligned with an organization's business impact analysis and is used to address risks that could threaten the organization's ability to continue operations after a disaster. The asset management policy includes the security operations and management of all IT assets within the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. The vulnerability assessment and management policy defines an organization-wide vulnerability window for production operating system and application software. You develop your organization-wide vulnerability assessment and management standards, procedures, and guidelines from this policy. And threat assessment and monitoring. This policy defines an organization-wide threat assessment and monitoring authority. You should also include specific details regarding the LAN-to-WAN domain and acceptable use policy compliance in this policy. And somebody's got to write all these, usually committees. It's not usually one person. Data classification standards. So again, like I said, every company is different. Private data is data about people that must be kept private. That might be personally identifiable information. Customers' user IDs, customers' MasterCard numbers, customers' names, addresses. Well, you wouldn't keep a customer's social security address, but it also might be employee names, addresses, and social security numbers, phone numbers, perhaps an employee's title or role in the company. Confidential information or data owned by the organization. So whereas private data, you have it, but it really belongs to somebody else. Confidential, it's owned by the organization. And typically confidential, I said, it could be throughout the organization. Somebody else may be able to get access to the information in another department, but it wouldn't go outside the company. Internal use only is information or data shared internally by an organization. This would probably be more general than confidential. Again, whereas confidential is owned by the organization, maybe there might be some confidential information that can't go out to other departments or can't go out to other people, but internal use possibly could go out to everybody in the organization. And public domain, this is stuff you can share with the public. You're going to have a product announcement. Now, you may want to keep that internal until you announce it, but once it gets out there by you, it is in the public domain. And so that's something that you need to make sure that you that you're prepared to make it go live. The best example I could give that, where you had confidential internal use only, was when New Coke came out in 1985, and I was a senior program analyst with Coca-Cola Company. So on that Friday afternoon before it came out on Monday, one of the employees I was working with on a project, he and I were working together, and the vice president of IT came in and said, no, the other guy was working for him that weekend. I go, what the heck is he going to do all weekend long? Well, Monday morning I found out when the Atlanta Journal-Constitution announced that we were going to have a new product release called New Coke or something. So I came into work Monday morning, and that guy was like bleary-eyed, and he had been working all weekend changing programs to match the new product package codes. So that was internal use only and could not go out to anybody. It couldn't even go out to me. I didn't know what he was doing. And that Monday we had the dog and pony show at the Fox Theater where Mr. Gosweta, the CEO of the company, announced New Coke, and Mr. Dyson, the president of Coke USA, was there for it and everything. And so then it became in the public domain. But an example of some of these later on was perhaps confidential or internal use only. I worked on the purchasing project. Our systems kept track of purchasing of raw materials. One of the things that we discovered in the manufacture of Coke was the disappearance in inventory of vanilla from Madagascar. What the heck's going on here? So that was shortly before New Coke was announced. I guess vanilla's not in it because about a week before the old Coke came back, we saw inventories of vanilla going back up again. And we saw it because we were inside the company, but anybody outside the company couldn't have seen it. And we saw it because our systems access that data. Okay, so in summary, for all of chapter one, we talked about information system security concepts, the CIA triangle of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the 7 domains of an IT infrastructure, the weakest link in the security of an IT infrastructure, which is you and your employees, and the IT security policy framework and data classification standards.